Hello again. This from our Year 4 bubble. I am going to read to you chapter 7 of Kensuke's Kingdom. And we have some of our learners here today in the bubble. Do you want to say hello?
Hello!
There we are. And I'll start here. There'll be the first 10 pages. And then the second part will have the rest of the chapter in it. So, we'll do some Vipers questions on the second part. Chapter 7. All that silence said. I smelt vinegar and thought I was at home. My father always brought us back fish and chips for supper on Fridays, and he loved to soak his in vinegar. The whole house would stink of it all evening. I opened my eyes. It was dark enough to be evening, but I was not at home. I was in a cave, but not my cave. I could smell smoke too. I was lying on a sleeping mat covered in a sheet up to my chin. I tried to sit up to look about me, but I could not move. I tried to turn my neck. I couldn't. I could move nothing except my eyes. I could feel, though, my skin, my whole body throbbed with searing pain, as if I had been scalded all over by hot water. I tried to call out, but could barely manage a whisper. Then I remembered the jellyfish. I remembered it all. The old man was bending over me, his hand soothing on my forehead. You better now, he said. My name Kensuke. You better now? I wanted to ask after Stella. She answered for herself by sticking her cold nose into my ear. I do not know for how many days I lay there, drifting in and out of sleep, only that whenever I woke, Kensuke was always there, sitting beside me. He rarely spoke, and I could not speak, but the silence between us said more than any words. My erstwhile enemy, my captor, had become my saviour. He would lift me to pour fruit juice or warm soup down my throat. He would sponge me down with cooling water, and when the pain was so bad that I cried out, he would hold me and sing me softly back to sleep. It was strange. When he sang to me, it was like an echo from the past. My father's voice, perhaps. I didn't know. Slowly the pain left me. Tenderly he nursed me back to life. The day my fingers first moved was the very first time I ever saw him smile. When at last I was able to turn my neck, I would watch him as he came and went, as he busied himself about the cave. Stella would often come and lie beside me, her eyes following him too. Every day now I was able to see more of where I was. In comparison with my cave down by the beach, this place was vast. Apart from the roof of vaulted rock above, you would scarcely have known it was a cave. There was nothing rudimentary about it. It looked more like an open-plan house than a cave. Kitchen, sitting room, studio, bedroom, all in one space. He cooked over a small fire which smoked continuously at the back of the cave, the smoke rising through a small cleft high in the rocks above. A possible reason, I thought, why there was no mosquitoes to bother me. There always seemed to be something hanging from a wooden tripod over the fire. Either a blackened pot or what looked like and smelled like long strips of smoked fish. I could see that dark gleam of metal pots and pans lined up on a nearby wooden shelf. There were other shelves too, lined with tins and jars, dozens of them, of all sizes and shapes hanging beneath them, innumerable bunches of dried herbs and flowers. These he would often be mixing or pounding, but I wasn't sure what for. Sometimes he'd bring them over to me so that I could smell them. Kensuke lived and worked almost entirely near the mouth of the cave house, where there was daylight. At nights he would roll out his sleeping mat across the cave from me up against the far wall. I would wake in the early morning sometimes and just watch him sleeping. He always lay on his back, wrapped in his sheet, and never moved a muscle. Kensuke would spend many hours of every day kneeling at the table and painting. He painted on large shells, but much to my disappointment, he never showed me what he had done. Indeed, he rarely seemed pleased with his work, for just as soon as he had finished, he would usually wash it all off and start all over again. On the far side of the cave mouth was a long workbench, and hanging up above it an array of tools, saws, hammers, chisels, all sorts. And beyond the workbench were 3 large wooden chests in which he would frequently rummage around for a shell, perhaps, or a clean sheet. We had clean sheets every night. The floor was entirely covered with mats made of woven rushes, like our sleeping mats, and everywhere, all around the cave to head height and above the walls, they were lined with bamboo. It was simple, but it was a home. There was no chatter. Everything had its place and its purpose. There was no clutter. As I got better, Kensuke would go off and leave me on my own more and more, but thankfully never for too long. He'd return later, very often singing, with fish perhaps, fruit, coconuts or herbs, which he'd bring over to show me proudly. The orangutans would sometimes come with him, but only as far as the cave mouth. They'd peer in at me and at Stella, who always kept a distance from them. Only the young ones ever tried to venture in, and then Kensuke only had to clap at them, and they'd soon scoot off. During those early days in the cave, I so much wished we could talk. There were 1,000 mysteries, 1,000 things I wanted to know, but it still hurt me to talk, and besides, I felt he was quite happy with our silence, and he preferred it somehow. He seemed a very private person. Then one day, after hours of kneeling, hunched over one of his paintings, he came over and gave it to me. It was a picture of a tree in blossom. His smile said everything. For you, Japan tree, he said. I, Japanese person. After that, Kensuke showed me all the paintings he did, even the ones he later washed off. They were all in black and white wash of orangutans, gibbons, butterflies, dolphins and birds and fruit. Only very occasionally did he keep one. In the daylight of each day, he would sit beside me and watch over me, the last of the evening sun on his face. I felt he was healing me with his eyes. At night I thought often of my mother and my father. I so much wanted to see them again, to let them know I was still alive. But strangely, I no longer missed them. In time I found my voice again. The paralysis gradually lost its grip on me, and my strength flowed back. Now I could go out with Kensuke whenever he invited me, and he often did. To begin with, I would squat on the beach with Stella and watch him spear fishing in the shallows. So still he stood, and his strike was lightning fast. Then one day he made me my own spear. I was to fish with him. He taught me where the bigger fish were. Kensuke seemed to know every tree in the forest, where all the fruit grew, what was ripe and what was not. He climbed impossible trees nimbly, footsure and fearless. Nothing in the forest alarmed him, not the howling gibbons swinging above his head, nothing. And always his family of orangutans would come along, shadowing us through the forest, patrolling the tracks ahead, scampering along. All Kensuke had to do was sing, and they'd come. One evening, quite unexpectedly, as I was watching Kensuke his fishing, one of the young ones clambered onto my lap and began to examine my nose with its finger, and then he investigated my ear. He pulled it rather harder than I liked, but I didn't yelp. After that, the rest followed suit, using me as I were a climbing frame, even the older ones. The bigger ones would reach out and touch me from time to time, but Stella still kept her distance. In all this time, I suppose, I must have been some months on the island by now. Kensuke had said very little. The English he did speak was clearly hard for him. When words were used between us, they proved to be a little help in our understanding of each other. Sometimes we even drew pictures to help. Pictures in the sand. It was just about enough to get along, but there was so much that I was burning to find out. How had he come to be here all alone? How long had he been here? And how had he come by all those pots and pans and tools and the knife? How come one of his wooden chests was stuffed with sheets? Where had they come from? Where had he come from? Why was he being so kind to me now, so considerate, when he clearly resented me before? But whenever I ventured any such question, he would simply shake his head and turn away from me, like a deaf person. I was never quite sure whether he really did not understand, or just did not want to understand. Either way, I could see it made him uncomfortable, so I probed no more. Questions, it seemed, I would have to wait to be answered. Our life together was always busy and regular as clockwork. Sometimes after a storm, we scoured the beach for some more of his painting shells. Only the biggest and flattest would do, or for the flopsome to join the stack of wood in the back of the cave. There were 2 stacks, one clearly for firewood, one else for woodwork. A short nap after lunch for both of us, and then he would settle down to the table to paint. As I watched, I became engrossed that the failing light of evening always came to me. We would cook a fish soup over the fire. Everything went in, heads and tails, a dozen different herbs. Kensuke wasted nothing, and there were always red bananas afterwards, all I could eat. I never went hungry. When supper was over, we would sit together at the mouth of the cave. Then, without a word, he'd stand up. We would bow solemnly to one another, and he would unroll his sleeping mat and leave me behind. To see Kensuke at his work was always a wonder to me. He was so intense, so concentrated in everything he did, but watching him paint was best of all. To begin with, he would only let me kneel beside him and watch. I could sense that in this too, he liked his privacy, that he did not want to be disturbed. On the table in front of him, he put out 3 saucers. He always held his brush very tight and dipped them into the different coloured paints. He would kneel bent over his work, his beard almost touching the shell he was painting. I think he was a little short-sighted, but he had such a sureness of touch. Then, one rainy afternoon, and when it rained, how it rained, I found he'd set out a shell for me, my own 3 saucers and my own paintbrush. He took such a delight in teaching me in my every clumsy attempt. I remembered early on I tried to paint the jellyfish that had attacked me. He laughed out loud at that, but not in a mocking way, rather in recognition, in memory of what had brought us together. I had always liked to draw, but from Kensuke I learned to love it, that to draw or paint, I first had to observe well, to look, then set out the form of the picture in my head, and send it down my arm through the tips of my brush onto the shell. He taught me all this entirely without speaking. He simply showed me. Well, in the next video, we will have the text on the screen, read together, and answer some questions, some Vipers questions about the second part of chapter 7. So, bye for now. What do we say, everyone?
Bye!